Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Margaret O'Brien, Director of the Thomas Coram Research Unit at UCL, and I'm delighted to welcome you to one of our lunchtime lectures. We are going to have a lecture from Professor Anne Phoenix. Anne Phoenix is Professor of Psychosocial Studies at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, Department of Social Sciences at UCL. And as you'll hear from her lecture, much of her research draws on mixed methods, including narrative approaches. Her research work includes an interest on social identities and the ways in which psychological experiences and social processes are linked in everyday practices and indeed in global context. The title of today's lecture that Anne's going to give is Telling Stories, Family Life and Social Science Research.
And giving up your lunchtime, what I want to do is to think about the whole issue of narrative research and the fact that it's proliferated. So if you do a quick Google search on narrative research, you see that 2.5 million hits are turned up. And if you look at since 2015, you see that there's still more than 75,000 hits. So a lot of people are publishing things which have narrative research in them. And yet at the same time, there are many people who think that if we're talking about stories, that we're not talking about anything really serious and systematic, and so it can't be research that you should take really seriously. And what I want to do in this talk is to convince you otherwise, if you're not already convinced. I want to start by thinking about why it is that narrative research has proliferated, and then I want to move on to tell you what narrative is, obviously very briefly, because a lot is written about it. And then I want to give some examples to make the case that, first of all, narrative is invaluable to social science researchers and others as well, but particularly thinking about social researchers here, and that it's invaluable partly because stories are persuasive. And what researchers do, regardless of what kind of research they're doing, is produce narratives to start with. So researchers are always producing narratives, but stories persuade in the everyday as well. They also construct identities, and one of the benefits of them is that they can be used with other methods, and so they're flexible. They're a really flexible approach, and I want to give indications of that. So first of all then, why is narrative research so popular? One reason is that we lead storied lives, as Kathy Riesman suggests, and many other people too. Jerome Bruner, who's done a lot of work on narratives and pushing the narrative turn, particularly in psychology, argues that we're homo neurans, that what distinguishes humans is that we're storytelling people, that it's a basic way of making sense of the world. We couldn't make sense of the world in any other way. And it's for that reason that children become skilled very early on at narratives, at telling narratives, at understanding them. And if you just look on this slide at what Stephen Wildish has produced as common fairy tale narratives, common nanny narratives, you don't even need to see the details to recognize that there are forms to narratives that we all recognize. And that when we get a new fairy tale narrative or a new nanny narrative that we've not heard of, that we can very quickly assimilate it because we already have the form from very early on. And obviously in different cultures, there'd be different sorts of narratives that children learn early on. And the picture down at the bottom right is Mary Poppins. So that's one of the common nanny narratives. For that reason, their familiarity, their basic way of making sense of the world, they're also persuasive. And it's not just to do with fiction. stories have political impact all the time, and indeed many political issues are turned into stories. And so they crystallize conflicts, and they're at the heart of social change as well. When I think about narratives that have been very popular and very powerful to do with politics, I always remember this one, The War of Jennifer's Ear. And in 1992, for the 1992 election, the Labour Party wanted to challenge John Major's Conservative government over its treatment of the National Health Service. And the story that held sway was about a 5-year-old girl who had been waiting almost a year at that point for an operation on her ear, a very common and ordinary operation. And that story became a defining issue and was the one that really played back and forth and had quite complicated impacts in that election. So much so that the Daily Telegraph earlier this year, when finding the election contest rather boring, said, and I quote, "This election campaign is crying out for a Jennifer's ear moment." Okay? So it's not only to do with fiction, it's also to do with politics and other things. And what that means is that stories are resources for research. That since people naturally use stories to make sense of the world, that we can think about people as storytelling peoples, as meaning-making peoples. So ontologically, stories are important. But they're also important epistemologically, whatever the epistemology you take. So whether you're going to use narratives, use stories to look at underlying truths. I'm terribly sorry, I think that's my own telephone, so it's just a text and it will go off in a moment. Whether we're looking at the analysis of truths and reality, or rather thinking about socially constructed meanings, we can use narratives. So different epistemologies allow engagement with narratives. And then they're flexible and dynamic. One can change what one does and still do narrative research, and change over time, change over the course of a research project, and so on. And also, because they can be used with other methods, they also mean that we can do both quantitative and qualitative work with narratives. Now, Jane Elliott, who is somebody who's most unusual because she both analyses large-scale data sets, longitudinal cohort studies, but also looks at narratives much more qualitatively as well and advocates for both, suggests that, this is in her inaugural professorial lecture in 2013, that statistical analyses are needed to address some of the key policy questions facing society today. However, we also have an obligation to pay attention to the individual stories that lie behind these statistics. And since Jane is now the director of the Economic and Social Research Council, maybe we'll have many more studies funded that do both things. Just to give an example of mixed methods that are not quantitative and qualitative, but here qualitative, a study by Rebecca O'Connell, Abigail Knight, and Julia Brannan on families and food in hard times used narrative archival research, so all old material. And you can see the sorts of things that they brought together. If you look in the top right, you can see there that there are sort of photographs of women queuing for food, so in food queues. I particularly like these infants queuing in their prams there. But post-war, a lot of queuing for food. Here, using cookery books. What were people told that they should cook in the post-war austerity when there was rationing? Again, this is a teenage cookery book, so really cool and hip for the period. And here, friends to tea, recipes for things like bacon and cabbage pie, and so on. As well as using diaries, as you can see on the left, and oral history archive material as well. So you can bring together a lot of sources to look at the ways in which food is not just asked about, but spontaneously spoken about, and so on. Okay, and I'm not quite sure what happened there, but we went back to the beginning. So you can combine narratives in a number of different ways. Moving on to the next bit of the talk, and what is narrative research? What is it about? And here a quote that many people cite because I think it does a really good job of saying what the different things to do with narrative are. So Kathy Riesman suggests that in everyday oral storytelling, a speaker connects events into a sequence that's consequential for later action and for the meanings that the speaker wants listeners to take away from the story. Events perceived by the speaker are selected, organised, connected, and evaluated as meaningful for a particular audience. And the reason that that's such a good, encompassing definition of what narrative is about connecting into sequence. So sequences being important and therefore temporality, but also some intention. What speakers say isn't only intentional, they sometimes convey things that they don't intend to, but always when they speak, they intend an overt meaning, and they want people to take that away from whatever they're saying, and particularly from the stories they tell. So the way that they see it, they connect things that they have thought of, they select them, and that's quite a difficult task. We all do it so quickly, we don't notice how difficult it is. But that for any story that we want to tell, we have to decide on a beginning, a middle, and end, and what we'll include and what we'll leave out. So, for example, if I were to tell you the story of my life, and I were to start with, for example, when my grandparents were born, and begin to tell you minute by minute what happened, you would all have left before I got to the 10th minute, okay? So before my birth. Quite a complicated task to think where to start and how to tell it. And we're all expert at doing it really fast. But for particular audiences, if I tell you the story of my life here in public, I'll tell it very differently from if I were to tell it to people that I know extremely well and in a private context rather than for media or something. So Jerome Bruner talks about life as narrative. Indeed, that's the title of one of his papers, Life as Narrative. And he suggests that we make and account for ourselves through autobiographical narratives. And I don't need to convince you that many people produce all sorts of autobiographical narratives. The world is groaning under the weight of the narratives that people produce as autobiographies or as biographies. And I couldn't resist having a photo here of Jerome Bruner last month celebrating his 100th birthday, because I think that he's a remarkable person in so many ways. Okay, so identity is linked with narrative. It's not just that people produce biographies and autobiographies because narrative is persuasive, but that identity is linked with the stories that we tell ourselves and other people. And as Jane Elliott and others say, we understand and present ourselves as living through time with a past, all of us with a past, living in the present, and in anticipation of the future. And all those things are unified in a plot, in a narrative plot, even if we're not aware of the plot. And those plots have beginnings, middles, and ends. And the book here that I've put a picture of is Dan P. McAdams' The Stories We Live By. He is a US personality psychologist, and from his work over the last few decades, he argues that people in the US, and I would argue not only in the US, that by the time they reach midlife, that they tend to come to a story to live by, which he calls the redemptive self. Regardless of what's happened to them in the past, regardless of what they've done, that they tend to say, well, look at me now. Okay? Either I've made something of myself, or I made lots of mistakes, but I've thought better of it. I can tell you this story. I understand myself. Okay? So he talks about the redemptive self. Other people, like Michael Bamberg, for example, talk about the way in which identities are done in interactions. And he talks about small stories, that rather than thinking only about grand narratives as being the focus of narrative research, we ought also to think about the way in which people in interactions are continually creating themselves and creating smaller stories than those grand narratives. And many people, in this case I've got Donald Polkinghorne, but many people talk about narratives as being reconstructions of the past in order to understand the present and in anticipation of the future. And I think that's terribly important, that the past is not static in narrative. We change it as our future changes. And the future changes because the things that we do in the present make some things just not as feasible as others. So what narrative does is keep together, keep in line the past, the present, and the future. So narrative research, therefore, is concerned with stories, certainly, but not only stories. It's also concerned with the way in which stories are constructed and presented. So narrative researchers might be interested in the structure of narratives, and if you're interested in that, then there are wonderful ways in which, for example, Lebov looks at typical story narratives and has a structure that he thinks that really good stories fit. I'm not so much into the structure because I think that that omits a lot of the ways in which stories are told in much fuzzier ways rather than simply neatly structured. But structure, one might be interested in. Certainly temporality, time and sequence, as well as looking at the overt content, themes, the way experiences are talked about, and the meanings and so on, as well as context and the cast of characters. Who populates stories? And just to give an example, I was once talking to somebody about their life story in research, and I said after about 40 minutes, well, I'm really interested that you haven't so far mentioned your mother, at which point that my research participant broke into a fit of coughing, which took quite a long time to recover from. Really interesting. You can tell your life story and get quite far without mentioning parents, whereas other people start with their parents. So narrative research materials include a number of things. They can be visual, they can be recorded and therefore transcribed or listened to, blogs, diaries, maps, objects, and also art. And if you're interested in that, the British Library Social Science Collection guides, which are online, talks about a number of things that might be analysed to do with narratives, some of which I've already talked about, so I won't go through these. Okay, moving on to the example that I want to give, and it comes from a programme of work called Novella, Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches. And this looks rather complicated, this diagram, but it has within it everything that Novella was about. So it was a National Centre for Research Methods research node, and it brought together 3 big projects. I'm frightened of moving this now in case suddenly I go back to the beginning again, but I'll try. So 3 big projects: parenting identities and practices, families and food, and family lives and the environment across continents. 2 small projects shared with other research node, food blogs, which was shared with another one, Mode, and Paradata, shared with the Hub. And it was about family habitual practices. On the left, you'll see what the conceptual connections and methodology was. All of them were about secondary narrative analysis, so narrative practices and identities. All of them linked different data sets. And we did a lot of training and capacity building. And at the moment, for this talk, I'm only going to give examples from family lives and the environment across continents. You can also see that the team was extremely large because it was these different projects and that it linked organizations. So UCL IOE, as well as the Centre for Narrative Research at UEL, University of East London, and Young Lives project at Oxford University, which included people at various Indian universities as well. Okay, so family lives and the environment. And it was concerned with understanding what environment meant to families and family members, and how both small local environmental issues and much larger environmental issues like climate change inflected people's everyday practices in their families and the narratives that they had to tell. So what was the meaning? How did that affect their habitual family lives? And Janet Boddy, myself, and various other people from both UCL, IOE, and Young Lives were linked in this particular project. And Janet's at Sussex University. Okay, so what we did was some secondary analysis of the Young Lives dataset. Now, Young Lives is a wonderful study lasting 15 years, a longitudinal study of young people living in 4 main countries who are living in poverty. One of those countries is India, Andhra Pradesh. So we did some secondary analysis of a few of their cases from Andhra Pradesh. Young people 12, 13 and 15, following them at 3 points. Then we did some new data collection in the UK and in Andhra Pradesh. And during the course of collecting the data, Andhra Pradesh divided into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. And we looked at 12-year-olds in particular as the focal child in a family, went to their schools, and also then went home and interviewed them, their parents. We did individual and group interviews. We did walking interviews. We got them to do a mapping exercise. And we also got them to do photography and so on. And we looked at families living in urban and rural contexts, those who were relatively affluent, some very affluent, and those who were living in poverty in their countries. One of the things that emerged very quickly is that there are diverse meanings of environment that very quickly come to the fore when you talk to people about their local environments and their more major environments. And very quickly, one can see how immediate big environmental considerations are or aren't for families in their everyday narratives. Here in Andhra Pradesh, 2 that emerged fairly quickly are encapsulated in these photographs that were taken by Janet Boddy when we were in India together. And the first is of Jasmine. And in Andhra Pradesh, women traditionally wear, adult women, jasmine flowers in their hair, both for reasons of smell, absolutely gorgeous perfume, and also to do with how it looks, so it's decorative. So that fresh jasmine is sold everywhere on the streets. But just before we arrived, there were unusual flooding events in Andhra Pradesh. What that meant was that some of the crop of jasmine had been washed away. Therefore, jasmine was much more expensive and therefore priced out of the range of women living in poverty, even though by our standards, of course, it was incredibly cheap. And that meant that everyday practices changed immediately for those living in poverty. They couldn't buy jasmine anymore. And the second picture, and that emerged from stories that people told us just incidentally, that it's just what they didn't do anymore. The second picture is to do with a lane where houses have not yet been built. On the other side of the lane, there's a new, what is called a colony. So it's a new housing estate. And there, the people who are living keep down the vegetation, but here it's not kept down. And that means that children living across the way are forbidden to play in this lane. And they're forbidden because the floods have meant that snakes have come out more. The snakes have escaped the floods, and they're much more likely to be living where there's a lot of vegetation. So it certainly changed what it is that people can do. And again, that was evident in the narrative. So family habitual practices had changed as a result of a big environmental issue. People recognized that. Okay? But then here, I just want to read 3 families' extracts, so that they take a little while to read, but I think they illustrate very much the way in which there are different meanings of the environment in family narratives. So here, an urban Indian girl living in a gated community, going to an independent school, an affluent family, who have lived in the United States, in Britain, and are back in Andhra Pradesh. So the mother says, if I switch on the air conditioning in my car, my kids will shout, Amma, you're increasing the global warming. Switch it off. Polar bears will die. And the mother laughs. Every time, this is the fight in the car. So Natasha, who was doing the interview, says, and what do you say when the kids say that? The mother says, we just laugh. We keep telling them it's not just because we switch on the AC. It is one of the factors, though. So Natasha says, so then what happens? Who wins? And Aruna, the mother, says, definitely them. You cannot argue with them. Then after a couple of minutes, they will forget, and then I will switch it on. I'm not supposed to lie, though, she laughs again. Especially this girl is very particular. Let's open the windows as we drive, because we will be killing the polar bears. I say, where do you see polar bears here? And whenever she turns on the AC, when she wants to sleep, I tell her, polar bears are crying. Why are you switching on the AC? Okay, and she laughs again. The thing that you get from this narrative analysis is that the emblem of the polar bear, it distances climate change from this family, really. The mother identifies as an affectionate partner mother. She talks about we do this, who allows her children power. She also has an affluent positioning. She's talking about air conditioning. And her everyday practices show how concern for the environment and comfort are negotiated. So it's not just that she's concerned for the environment, and so therefore she does something different, but that her concern for the environment, which is really there, is tempered by their everyday practices. Humphrey's family here. So Roger, the father, again an independent school, this time in Britain, and urban context. We've changed the way in which we live over the last 10 years to minimise our carbon footprint. We think that if everybody did, I suppose, took the same responsible position that we were taking, then the whole country's carbon footprint would be, we'd meet our targets that we're supposed to be reducing by 2020 fairly easily, I would have thought. And Julia, the mother, says, I think it's partly because we read the newspaper. I've been quite startled at intelligent, I thought well-informed people who just last year were not aware that fish stocks were running out. And Humphrey, the son, says, even I knew that. And Julia says, well, that's partly because we keep telling you. Okay, so thinking about narrative, distant environmental issues are here brought into their everyday practices. And there are identities that are being claimed here to do with morality and to do with the moral identity of responsible affluence, and also the identity of being intelligent and well-informed. And one of the things that happens here is that the environmental practices display family in Janet Finch's terms. So it puts a boundary around the family, it shows what kind of family they are, and that they are a family. But it also displays power relations, and they invoke the past, the present, and the future, the temporality as consequential, and make a case for everybody changing their everyday practices. Quite a different example also from an urban UK context, with here Nathan going to a state school. So the mother, Jordan, says, what goes on in our lives every day matters to me more than what goes on in the environment. Okay? Nathan, and I'll skip that little bit, and Nathan says, did you know pollution can kill you? And the mother ignores that, and she carries on, because that's what affects us the most. So Helen, doing the interview, says, are there any particular things in your immediate environment that affect you more than other things? And she says, well, just every general daily life, like making sure the kids get to school, the shopping's done, it's just washing, everything, general living. That's what we have to deal with. And here, her family displays very much to do with the everyday mundane tasks that are crucial to social reproduction. So her temporality is about that. And for her, environmental issues have to be subordinate to the stresses of everyday life and managing social reproduction. And in doing this, she takes up an identity as a responsible mother who fulfills her care responsibilities. So to summarize those, what analysing everyday environmental stories illuminates is the situated nature of environmental practices and the diverse meanings of the environment. Also the centrality of the everyday and of how the past, the present and imagined futures tie up together in making families either deal with or not deal with big environmental issues in the present local environment. And I think crucially, it also does social policy issues. And I say that because sometimes people think that only large-scale longitudinal studies or randomized controlled trials can do this. But in fact, what it does is show how children as the future can influence parents' environmental practices only in limited ways. You see that in many of the examples, Nathan, and in Aruna's example as well. So Nathan's ignored, Aruna takes account of what her children say only to a certain extent, and in the other example, Humphrey is portrayed really as ignorant, not knowing as much as his parents. It also shows how socioeconomic circumstances, identities, and place are central to imagined environmental influence and need to be taken into account in narratives if we're really going to affect climate change, for example, and meet our targets. So to finish off, what I've been arguing is that narrative is crucial to social research because we lead storied lives and we story our identities, that narrative is a resource for organizing and understanding events and experiences, that narratives are persuasive, and that narrative research is flexible. It's also extremely systematic because it's a research method. And what I haven't said, but I think that is really important, is that narrative research is endlessly fascinating as well as being worthwhile. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was fascinating, and I think you'll all agree that we've had some extraordinary insights into the methodology and some of the findings that emerge from it. Okay, now there's a chance for questions from our audience. When you ask a question, if you could just say who you are, that would be really helpful. And there is a roving microphone as well. Thank you.
They don't have to say who they are. They don't want to podcast.
You don't have to say who you are, actually.
That's because it's being podcast, so if you don't want to identify yourself, you don't have to.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So my question is that, thank you for your lecture. I mean, it was very interesting. How you, so there's an interview and all that, and when you reanalyzing it, and there's the editing process goes through, right? And so my question is that how much you can trust the conversations or the answers for the interview from an interviewer, because they might present a certain way, or anyway. So that was my question. How much you can trust?
Okay, that's a really important question and one that gets asked a lot. So when people are telling you stories, for example, are they fabricated? And there are two ways to think about this. One is, one of the benefits of narrative analysis is understanding how people actually talk. So you're getting to grips with that. And remembering that actually most people don't set out to lie, but that we're all very limited in our perspectives and indeed in things like memory. And alongside, and something that I didn't have time to address, is a whole notion of what constitutes memory. We all reconstruct our memories, and so people sometimes really genuinely believe certain things that either didn't happen. I mean, Elizabeth Loftus, for example, is a psychologist who's shown that very persuasively, and how you can persuade people into saying certain things. So one of the things that narrative analysis does that, for example, questionnaires can't, because questionnaires have to take on board what people are saying, is not only treat people's accounts seriously, but look at the way that they're constructed. And that, depending on the epistemological position that you're taking, you can actually look at other things. You can look at the context. You can look at the historical context, the local context. You can look at consistencies or not. You can look at what they've said in other part of their interviews. And you can also look at what the emotional and meaning-making processes are that are going on and how they're constructing identities. So it allows so much more complexity. And you can also say, not that you then disbelieve everything that people say, but that you can contextualize it, that they are talking about a context in which certain things were likely or unlikely. Certain things are vivid to them, certain things seem like new stories for them, Other ones are well-worn, and we know that once stories are well-worn, like all of us have practice at telling our life stories to some extent. And the more you tell the life story, the more vivid some things get, because you're remembering the last time you told the story and the reactions you got and so on, and the less vivid other things get. We also remember certain things about our life story because other people have told us, or because there's a photograph, and so on. So I'm saying that that complexity can't be addressed in other modes of research, but can be addressed in narrative research. The difficulty is, then, that you have to give it the time to do it, and you have to be systematic in interrogating it. And I think from the examples that I gave you, you'll see that I wasn't saying that, you know, this car journey actually happened, you know, but it's likely that there have been many car journeys where that sort of tussle occurred. It doesn't matter if this one particular one occurred in that way or not.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm interested in trends. For instance, some children survive in cruel environments without a father. Did you notice trends of people, for instance, who have had no father and cruelty but succeed, and others who have cruelty and dilapidate their environments? And, you know, did you look at trends, or do you just sort of present it in great global gulps, if you know what I mean?
Okay. The sort of research that I do...
Oh, can I just say, I wasn't going to say, but it's interesting culturally how at one stage the voice of a child wouldn't be heard, say with these paedophilic incidents, and now they are being heard, and then again they've stopped being heard because they think it's lying. You know that voices have different levels of potentiality, perhaps.
Okay. To answer the first part of your question, the sort of research that I was doing wasn't that sort of research. We know that there are all sorts of things that lead to particular children faring well or badly from all sorts of circumstances with a great deal of disadvantages and so on. And in fact, Alison Park, who's here, some of the research that she talked about when she did a lunchtime lecture, I think you were at a couple of weeks ago, shows, children from different environments faring in particular ways and so on. And we know from the resilience literature that it's quite complicated what leads to what. So it's not a characteristic of the child, and it's not just the environment, but it's what happens along the way and so on. So there's that. And then the whole issue about temporality, time, of course, there are different moments in history where children, women, all sorts of people are allowed to speak and their voices are heard around some things. But in different families, children or different individuals are heard or not in different ways. Okay, so even though there's a particular historical period and certain stories are allowed, we tell our life stories in a different way than they would have been told 50 years ago. And we tell them differently than people will 50 years down the line. There is genre that become acceptable at particular historical periods, but nonetheless, there are different families that allow different ways of speaking and so on, plus also different things. So even in those small examples that I gave you, you saw that in one instance, a child who is trying to give the environmental line is not heard for a particular reason. In another, the child claims ignorance about environmental issues, or most environmental issues in comparison with parents. So it's quite complicated, what's heard, what's not. But I think an important point is to recognise that we can't see very easily that we are limited by genre, but that we are as well.
There's time for one more question. Lady at the back.
Thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, in narrative research, as an interviewer, how much do you control or guide the narrative? Do you go in with set questions? Do you reformulate your questions as the narrative goes? How do you do it?
Okay. Well, at the extreme, one version of narrative research is a life history biographical interview. And there, you simply say to people, well, tell me your life history, tell me your story, I won't interrupt. And people speak for as long as they want to. One of the things that's good about that is that you can see where they start. I said at the beginning that it is very difficult to start a story. And when you give people free rein, you see what they choose to start with and where they go on and what they struggle over. And that's really illuminating. Most people doing narrative research have a particular topic. It's not a narrative if you keep interrupting people, so you have to allow them to talk, you know, for as long as they possibly can, but you can ask particular questions, but you follow them. Okay, I think we have to leave.
I need to interrupt Anne. Thank you very much indeed for your questions and particularly for Anne for her very illuminating talk. Thank you.